Welcome to today's sessions on archetypes. I'd like to spend the next 20 or 25 minutes talking about what are archetypes, what's the benefit of getting to understand them, what you can actually do with them, and then spend some time answering questions about specific aspects of them that I've presented and other things that might come to mind. So a systems archetype is a well-defined structure, well-defined set of relationships that frequently occurs over and over and over again. And that structure produces a very characteristic pattern of behavior. Because of the nature of those relationships, there's a pattern of behavior that shows up that gives you a sense of what the set of relationships are that are producing that pattern of behavior. And the real benefit for understanding archetypes is that every one of them has a very well-defined, proven strategy for dealing with that set of relationships. Now, where the archetypes came about, Ludwig von Bertalanffy in 1937 first proposed that there were basic underlying structures that operate across all branches of science. And the first time I read that, I said, how can that be? Though after I thought about it for a while, I realized that all of the branches of science are a fabrication of man, not nature. So if we only have one universe, why wouldn't there be a common set of structures that operate across all branches of science? And what Bertalanffy thought was, if one learned about these structures and how they operated, one could take a lot of their learning from one discipline to another. They just had to learn what structures were operating and what the labels were on the structures. And he first conceived of this approach to doing general systems teaching. But it was written in German, and the translator made a mistake and translated as general systems theory, so that for the rest, and that stuck, and for the rest of his life he was saddled with something that he never intended, because people just wanted a general systems theory. The label systems archetype actually never showed up until Senge wrote The Fifth Discipline, which was a long time afterwards. I mean, that was in the early 80s. So it was from 37 until the early 80s until somebody actually put the systems archetype label on these structures. Now, if you've been in any of these sessions so far, you've seen a couple of the archetypes. The first one is a goal-seeking structure. It's a balancing loop, which begins with some current state, some desired state, which produces a gap, which is the reason for some action intended to move the current state in the direction of the desired state, making the gap smaller, and until such time as the action takes the current state to the desired state and the goal is achieved. Every one of these archetypes that I'm going to present, I will present a causal loop structure for it and a simulation model done in InsightMaker, which you can interact with and play with to get a better sense of how that set of relationships evolves over time. So while this is the causal loop structure, this is the simulation structure in InsightMaker, where there's a current state, a desired state. This is the gap. The gap is responsible for the action. And this is simply a factor to say what percentage of that gap is applied every time step. So when I simulate this, notice that this is the goal, the desired state, which is 1. The current state starts out as 0. And the gap is therefore the difference between 0 and 1, which is 1. And the action, which is the difference between them, which in this instance, the action factor is 1, meaning that the situation goes from 0 to the desired state in 1 time step, which is usually unrealistic. So that if I go ahead and change the action factor so that In other words, 9 women can't have a baby in 1 month. There's a reality associated with it. If you've got some amount of work that takes 10 person days and you only have 1 person, they're not going to finish it in 1 day. So that if you actually even this out so that the action is applied little by little by little, this is the characteristic curve that you get for a goal-seeking structure. Here's the goal. Here's the current state beginning at 0. There's some amount of action that happens, and the initial gap between the two is the difference between the desired state and the current state. And as the action happens, the current state increases and the gap gets smaller. And then over time, you finally get to a point where the current state reaches the desired state, so the gap is 0 and there's no more action. This is the characteristic structure that you see for any goal-seeking, or the characteristic behavior that you see for any goal-seeking structure. Any questions? So this is one of the 2 basic structures from which all archetypes are evolved. The second one is an exponential growth structure, which begins with some action that produces a result that's responsible for more of the same action. So you end up with something that produces exponential growth. Population growth, growth in a savings account, which never grows as fast as someone would like it to. And if you take that and turn it into a simulation model, it looks like this, where there's a result, there's an action that produces the result, and that action is dependent upon the amount of the result, and the factor simply says what percentage of that result is actually applied as action. So if I simulate this in the initial sense where the results are 1 and the action factor, this is actually 1024 after 10 periods, because it's 2 to the 10th. You know, it's 0, then it's 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, and it just accumulates. And the structure that gets produced is an exponential growth structure. Now, the choppy nature of this is simply because I'm using a large time step. And if you get into simulation, you'll learn about the use of time steps and how you need to adjust them to produce a result that's more appropriate with reality. But for this purpose, the idea was just to give you a sense that there's a exponential growth that results because the action is dependent upon the result, and the result is dependent upon the action. If you did this one where I changed the action to 0.5, notice that the end result for this, why has this table not got a legend on it? Sorry, okay. So that the result here only gets to 57 after the same time. Notice the difference between, by simply cutting the action in half, the difference is 57.6 as opposed to 1,024. There's the difference between the effect that the interest rate has on the growth of a savings account. Now, in all of these simulations, and when I send out the update at the end of this session with a link to the video, you'll also get a link to this session here in this structure in Archetypes. For everyone, and these are all linked into there. For every one of these, you can come in here and you can do these simulations. You can simulate them. You can change the values to see the effect of changing the different parts on the simulation to get a better sense of how the relationships interact to produce those results. So the two basic structures are goal-seeking structures and exponential growth structures. It's sort of like the electron and the proton in all of the elements of the periodic table, and the archetypes go together and have a set of relationships. What's this? So very much like a table where the goal-seeking structure is to fix a problem and the exponential growth is growth. If you set out to fix a problem, linear progress may slow over time. And over time, there may be a tendency to settle for less. The fix may overshoot the goal. Things may seem to oscillate endlessly. The fix creates a problem elsewhere. Things get better, and then they get worse. The reason for that often is because the underlying cause is not being addressed, and that often develops into a dependence on the fix or an addiction structure. When you promote growth, growth may lead to decline elsewhere. The partners for growth may become adversaries. The growth may slow over time. The reason for the slowing over time may be because of limited resources shared by others. There's more than one limit that has to be addressed. The limit is insufficient capacity, and that insufficient capacity may be due to the tendency to let the standard slip. So there are 17 of these archetype structures that I'm aware of, and for every one of them, there is a causal loop diagram and a simulation that you can call up and interact with to get a better sense of them. So that when you get this particular link to this point, if you go to archetypes, there's the basic structures, which are the fix a problem and promote a growth. And for every one of these, it has its own video that explains the structure to you and the simulation. And there's a link to the model itself. So you can go here and access them. There is also a number of articles here about archetypes written by different people. Most of the way well, let me go ahead and talk about a couple of them first, and then you'll get a sense of what I wanted to explain. Let's see, things get better and then they get worse over time. This is typically what's referred to as fixes that fail structure. You find a problem that it's a situation that you realize has to be dealt with. So it's a basic goal-seeking operation. The difficulty arises because the action taken produces over some time, produces an unexpected consequence, which actually diminishes the current state. So while you work to fix the problem, something is creeping up on you in the background that you're not aware of. And that's why it's called unexpected consequences. So if you simulate this, this is the basic goal-seeking structure, and this is the unexpected consequence that grows and diminishes the current state. So if you simulate this, this is the basic goal-seeking structure with the goal, the way that the current state evolves, the desired, this is the desired state. The gap gets smaller as the action is applied. What happens with the unexpected consequence as that begins to develop, notice that the current state isn't reaching the goal in the time that it would have. And if the unexpected consequences are sufficient or grow sufficiently rapidly, notice that it approaches the goal and then actually begins to get worse. And I didn't take it farther, but you could take it far enough. Let me go ahead and do this. Go. In this particular instance, if I go ahead and pin this graph to the results and then go over here and say, let me say that the factor to control the extent to which unexpected consequences applied, if I do this, notice that the current state is consistently getting worse, simply because if you look at this, you can make this small, because this unexpected consequence is developing more rapidly and causing the current state to be diminished. So when you interact with these, which you can do with all of the ones that I will show you, you can pin the link to the model, and then you can come over here and play with the values to see how they alter the interaction. Okay? Any questions about fixes that fail? Tendency to settle for less is a situation that you have probably run into more than once, in that given a goal-seeking structure, this is what I have, this is what I want, so I take action to actually move what I have in the direction of what I want, though there's a delay here. In other words, it takes time to move what I have in the direction of what I want, and because that gap that exists also creates a pressure to settle for less, with some delay causes me to diminish what I want. What you're looking at is the recurring New Year's resolution to lose 20 pounds. So that the initial gap, the initial goal is, this is what I weigh and this is what I want to weigh, and the difference is 20 pounds. So I diet, and with some delay, I begin to lose weight, which moves me closer to my goal. Though it's taking time, and after I lose 10 pounds, I seem to have plateaued and I'm not getting anywhere. So the gap that remains causes a pressure to settle for less. So I finally get to a point of saying, well, 10 pounds is enough. So I don't have to strive anymore because I already got there. It's a personal, ongoing problem. So this is the same causal loop structure turned into a simulation structure, where here's the desired state, goal, and the current state, desired state. This is the initial goal, this one here, and this loop is the settle for less, where that tension causes the goal to be reduced over time. So if you look at this, this is the standard goal-seeking structure, and the goal is reached in a short enough period of time so that tension to settle for less doesn't have an impact. But if I, in fact, cause the goal reduction to come into play faster, notice that this was the goal, and the goal actually diminishes over time as I'm approaching that goal. The current state is approaching. I've diminished the goal. I mean, the easiest way to succeed is say that you're there. And this happens over and over and over again in numerous environments, numerous contexts. And if you think for just a moment, you could probably come up with one or two. In the same sense as the other ones, I said you can go ahead and play with this structure. This is the percentage change is 0.5, so that you're approaching the goal faster so that it doesn't decrease quite so much. And you can simply come in here and pin this to the model, and you can alter the parameters to see how it's going to change and impact it. Questions?
Could it be possible to have, in the model that you had on Insight Maker, to have one tank, the desired state, and not having two? No? If you go back to the...
With tendency to settle for less, or the
Yes, yes, the last one, yes, to settle for less.
Okay.
We have the current state and the desired state, like stocks, no?
Right, they're stocks.
Yes. Is it possible to have like the state as a stock, and then draw the not having two, because desired state as a stock and current state as a stock?
Okay, so in a simulation model,
Yes.
if you are going to create a loop, the loop has to have at least one stock in it. Otherwise, when it attempts to simulate, it will think you're trying to do instantaneous changes, and it will give you an error message. And we want this. And in other words, tension is a computed value. If you look at this, there's a formula. It's simply the desired state minus the current state. It's an instantaneous computation. Stocks are things that increase or decrease over time because of some inflow or outflow. And one of the things that when people think about situations, one thing that seems to consistently get them in trouble is not realizing the difference between variables and stocks. So that, as I said, 9 women can't have a baby in 1 month. There's some physics associated, some natural laws associated with the nature of the situation. So that, you know, the book A Mythical Man Month, which was written in the 80s, says, adding additional programmers to a late software project only makes it later because of the nature of the relationships. There are some things that you can't change instantaneously. They have to. The town takes trash to the landfill, truckload by truckload, year after year after year. There is no way that you can clean up the landfill in a couple months because of the nature of the accumulation that has to be dealt with. Well, maybe you can cover it over in a couple of months and not tell anybody it's there. But it's the difference in the nature between stocks and instantaneous values. And in any simulation model, any loop has to have at least one stock. It can have multiple, but it has to have at least one. Does that help?
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay.
It has been said that it is beyond our mental capacity to intuit the implications of any set of relationships that has 2 or more stocks in it. Personally, I've decided that it's 1 or more stocks with a delay. Here is a goal-seeking structure with a delay in it, so that I have a current state and a desired state, which produces the gap, and there are influences causing action to move the current state toward the desired state. Though the structure differs in that there's a delay here, or there's a delay here. If I turn this into a simulation model, it looks like the standard goal-seeking structure with one change in that there's a time delay here, so that there's a delay between the time that the current state changes and there's a realization that that change happened. What this does to the result is, if there is no delay, this is the standard typical goal-seeking structure. If you begin to introduce a delay, here's a delay of 1 where the action, because the action is based upon inappropriate historical information, they're overacting, and the acting is actually causing the current state to evolve beyond what the desired state is. So then it's necessary to take action to bring the current state back down to where the goal is. If you continue to increase the time delay, the situation gets worse. So the only thing I'm changing is the time delay. And here, with a time delay of 3, this structure never achieves the goal. It oscillates forever. And if you go even further, the structure ends up being out of control and the thing will destroy itself because the action is based upon historical information that isn't correct. So in dealing with this particular structure, what one needs to do is realize that there's a delay in the structure and either slow down the action so that you're not acting too fast, or figure out how to get more current data about where the current state really is. And people have often said, when I show this, well, how can you not know what the current state is? And my comment is, imagine trying to drive the Mars rover, where the picture you see of where the rover is 9 minutes old. And if you tell it to do something, it takes it 9 minutes for it to realize you told it. And then it takes another 9 minutes for you to realize whether or not it actually did it. So that, you know, I can't imagine how they do that, but they figure it out somehow. Any questions about this structure? For every one of these structures, it will tell you what the structure is, and it will provide the well-defined strategy for dealing with that particular structure. And they're all structural responses to the structure. In this one, you can reduce or remove the delay. You can delay action until the current state is really sensed, or you can reduce the action to make smaller adjustments so you don't overcompensate for where the thing is. So in terms of goal-seeking structures, let me go back and look at some growth structures. One is, this is a structure based upon a exponential growth model as opposed to a goal-seeking structure. So this is a limits to growth, where this is the exponential growth structure. The result actually influences some slowing action, and there's a limiting factor. And when that's reached, it actually begins to limit the results. So in this case, here is the exponential growth, and the action creates some slowing action with a limit, which ends up limiting the results. So go ahead.
Here you have 2 loops and 1 result as a tank, as a
right, as a stock, right?
As a stock.
So each loop does have a stock in it. It just happens to be the same stock in 2 loops.
It couldn't be for the other example, like saying my weight. If your example is, your weight is the stock, and then putting the 2 loops on 1 stock.
So I could go back. Let's see. I think this is the one you were talking about. The drifted goes to settle for less, right?
Yes.
So
what is the difference between this one, where we had to have 2 stocks, and the other? Because the current state, desired state, let's say the state, or we can define it like your weight. When you talked about your weight and trying to reduce
Right,
your
right. So this is my current weight, and this is my desired weight. Now, if this was just a variable as opposed to a stock, when this changed, this tension trying to change that variable, this would be an instantaneous change loop. And simulation models can't do instantaneous changes. They have to deal with, what they do is they do integration over time, step by step by step. They break things down into little tiny pieces and evolve them. So it can't do an instantaneous change. That's why it's simply in other words, if you built an analog simulation, you could do that. Though for a digital simulation, there has to be a stock in a loop.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So for the limits to growth structure, this is the exponential growth that's happening. Though as that action happens, it begins to produce some slowing action which limits the results. And it may be limited in several different ways. So here, the results, as the slowing action begins to increase, it actually limits this part is exponential growth that begins to limit off. And then the results are limited because of the slowing action that has developed. This one, what did I do this one? This one is simply because there's a hard limit and it increases to a point, and then when it reaches that hard limit, it just flattens out. This particular situation is the overflow protection in the bathtub. Something that increases exponentially, and then there's simply a limit to how much can be there, and then it stops. It can't grow anymore because whatever that limit is, it has precluded any more growth whatsoever. And this particular bump that's in here is simply because of the step size that I've picked for this simulation. I could make this a shorter time step, and this would essentially go away. Okay. Let me do one more of these. Let's see. Fix origins. Oh, I'm back on the wrong ones. Hold on. So as I said, for each one of these, there's a video that goes through and explains each one of the structures, and there's a simulation model associated with it. Dependence, growth structures. Okay. This is the limited resources are shared by others, which is actually called a tragedy of the commons structure. There are two exponential growth structures where A's activity produces A's results, which creates more of A's activity. B's activity creates B's result, which creates more of B's activity. Though when these two operate, they use the same available resources. People fishing in the same fishery, and the difficulty is that their activity adds together to consume the available resources, and there's a limit to the resources. So that if you begin to put this together in a simulation model and simulate it, what happens is that notice that A and B's results are one on top of the other, so you can't see them at the moment. That as the resource available declines, while there's an exponential growth in the result of A and B, when it gets to a certain point where the resources are exhausted, it's not possible to grow anymore. They've reached their limits to growth because they've consumed all the resources. If you go ahead and then put some amount of replenishment, if B starts higher than A, B stays higher than A, but when they consume the resources, they both stop growing also. Starting ahead only gets you ahead until you don't grow anymore. If there is a replenishment of the resources, in other words, the resources available actually have some replenishment rate so that, the fish multiply. If you don't consume the fish faster than they multiply, you can continue to grow, but you can only continue to grow to the limit of the replenishment of that resource. And typically for resources, they have a minimum level of existence, whereby if you exceed that, the population simply falls apart. And they have overfished numerous fishing areas in the ocean already, and they can't fish there anymore because it's dead. But this is what happens with the tragedy of the commons. They simply exhaust the resource if it isn't managed appropriately. And for this particular situation, they can collaboratively, they can understand what it is that they're dealing with. They have a limited resource. The same thing would happen for multiple farmers grazing the same pasture land. If they realize that they are dealing with a shared resource, they can collectively manage their consumption of the resource so they don't exhaust it, or someone else has to manage the resource and manage them so they don't exhaust the resource. The terrible nature of this structure is that neither A nor B wants to quit on their own, because they realize that if B stops, A will go ahead and consume all the resources and succeed. So it's a vicious structure because of the nature of the interaction and what it is that's being consumed. Questions?
Gene, the results in this case is cumulative?
Well, A's results and B's results are independent of each other, so that you could look at what is the cumulative results of the two.
Yeah, it's cumulative, okay.
And it's a cumulative consumption of the available resources. So the idea is that I have put all of these together.
One more question on the strategy of the commons. Can you also optimize it so that the cumulative results keeps growing forever, so that you manage the commons? How would you adjust the system?
Well, if you wanted for A and B's results to continue to grow, you would have to figure out how to continue to grow the available resource. If there is a market for this in this particular market area, and company A and company B are both competing for that market, the market is of a given size, and the market is probably growing at some amount based upon new potential buyers in that marketplace. Though when A and B consume all of the current potential in the marketplace, there's no way to grow anymore. They're simply continuing to service their existing customers. They would have to figure out how to grow the market. You know, the tobacco industry figured out how to grow the market by advertising to children, right? Sorry, that's a terrible example, but they did. The sugar industry figured out how to grow its market by demonizing fat. We're terrible people. So did that help?
Yeah, so if you only can consume the growth of the resources to keep the resources stable.
Right, and because this is a critical resource to the results of the participants, the growth is limited to the resource that exists. So if they can figure out how to grow and use less of it, or figure out how to increase that particular resource so there is more of it for them to use, then both of them, all of the participants, could in fact grow.
Okay.
Okay. Other questions? I couldn't have been that clear.
I have found a positive archetypes, because in general the archetypes are seems to be negative.
Okay. So there happens to be there's actually an article here connected to archetypes called Positive System Archetypes.
Yes, this is it.
Okay. So when one runs into an archetype, it's typically perceived as being negative. It represents a situation that needs to be dealt with because the situation is undesirable. So that if you have an accidental adversaries scenario where these two groups that should have been synergistic and contributing to each other's success are actually contributing now to each other's failure, you want to figure out how to deal with it so that they're contributing to each other as opposed to contributing to each other's demise. Based upon the relationship of these archetypes, if you set out to fix a problem, you know it's a goal-seeking structure, and you also have an awareness that that structure easily evolves into this, 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 or this. So what you do is you become proactive. You begin to look for, okay, what could be unexpected consequences that would get in the way of fixing this problem? Or how could fixing this problem create a problem elsewhere? Or how is it that the progress that we're making is likely to slow over time? So because you have a sense of how these things could evolve, you can become proactive and sort of head them off at the pass. The difficulty that we have is we haven't yet figured out how to reward people for problems that they didn't fix. I mean, organizations reward firefighters for saving the organization at the 11th hour. And the firefighters happen to be the ones typically sitting around waiting for fires to occur so that they can make a name for themselves when they save the organization at the 11th hour. The same way with growth structures. If you succeed in creating an exponential growth structure, you should not be happy with the situation. The first thing that you should begin to do is look at, okay, where is this growth likely to decline over time? Where's the limit likely to be? is there a possibility for this to turn into an accidental adversary structure? Where is it that this could become a success to the successful structure, so that we figure out how to avoid that ahead of time? And in that instance, all of the archetypes become positive awarenesses of potential futures that you can figure out how to deal with before they happen. Thoughts? It's a lot to digest.
If you have a system in Kumu,
Okay.
what would you recommend? To put it in Insight Maker and then look what's going to happen, or?
Well, okay. For all of these that I have shown you, the qualitative causal loop diagram was done in Insight Maker because I was going to build a simulation model and I wanted them in the same environment. If I'm going to build a qualitative relationship model, 95% of the time I will build it in Kumu, because it is just so fluid and easy to do, and it's much easier to create presentations in Kumu than it is in Insight Maker. If I know that I'm going to do a simulation model, then I'll probably do the qualitative model in Kumu, in Insight Maker. Though if there is a situation where I want the model to look in a particular way, this is a qualitative relationship model which was done in Insight Maker because of the way that I wanted the images to look, because I couldn't do this set of images like this in Kumu.
Okay.
Does that help?
When you're using Kumu, how do you recognize the loops and the archetypes?
In Kumu?
Yeah.
In the same way, if I go, let's see.
Do you work with colors or?
Well, in the events, if you go back to the session that was done on 514, which is linked into the events here on the left, okay? And if you go to the Kumu template, the template itself is one reinforcing and one balancing loop. Okay?
Yeah.
And all of the other structures that you build in Kumu, relationship models, are some combination of these two structures. So if I look at something more complex, let me find... storytelling. Hold on, I'll find it in a second. Threads. It's all connected. Storytelling. All right. Okay. This is a relationship model done in Kumu. It has to do with unwanted births and pregnancies. So that here is a loop, the burden of parenthood, which is simply unwanted pregnancy, unwanted births, and financial insecurities. You can tell one loop from another based upon walking the loop and counting the number of of subtracts from or opposite relationships in the loop, so that this has one. If there's an odd number, it's a goal-seeking structure. If it's an even number, it's a exponential growth structure. So if I look at this one, it has two subtracts from opposite relationships in it, which means it's a reinforcing structure, even though there's a bunch of relationships in it. Does that answer the question, or did I miss the point?
Yeah, okay, you have to count, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, in Insight Maker, there is an option to actually identify loops, so that here it says activity results activity, activity results. So you can then count here to see the number of subtracts from or opposite relationships in the loop. If you color code it so that you can readily tell which ones are which. Now, in this particular one, this was a relationship model that somebody else built that I thought was very nice for explaining some aspects of storytelling. And I then went ahead and tried to simplify this relationship model, and what I produced was not that simple. And as I was then being frustrated about doing this, I realized that I had an aha moment and found out that this structure is actually a very simple shifting the burden structure, where this part of the model is accommodate births, this part of the model is avoid births, and this part of the model is avoid pregnancy. And then there's a couple of relationships that actually weren't in that model. And I have often pondered the idea that given any complex set of relationships, someplace at the heart of this set of relationships, there's one or a couple of archetypes that are really responsible for what's happening in the structure. And this actually served to demonstrate that, because you can get lost in this set of relationships until you realize that a whole bunch of them are trying to accommodate unwanted births. Part of it's trying to avoid unwanted births, and part of it's trying to avoid pregnancy, which gives you a much simpler understanding of this whole set of relationships. Maybe. But this is one of the archetypes. It just happens to be two shifting the burden. Well, it's a shifting the burden with another shifting the burden tied in as part of it. So rather than spend the additional time that it takes to do the education to avoid pregnancy, I figure out how to accommodate the unwanted births. Or rather than spending the extended time that it takes to do the education and avoid pregnancy, I figure out how to avoid the births by abortion or something. So, other questions? Have any of you gone and wandered around in the structure? Does it drive you nuts? What? Okay.
In which structure?
In other words, every time I've done one of these sessions, I've gone ahead and published a link to that context within this environment. So here's the Kumu relationships Here's the insight maker relationships, the insight maker simulation, storytelling, and the group modeling part 1, and this is archetypes. And when I send out a link to the video, I send out a link to this particular node or thought in this structure, which then gives you access to all of these pieces.
I've seen it, but I'm not that far for looking into it. So
Okay.
I have to catch up something.
Okay. All right. Well, I would encourage you to when I send out the update, to go to the environment and actually interact with some of these structures to get a better sense of what the relationships are and the implications of them, and what the patterns of behavior are once one becomes aware of what the archetypes are. Once you sense that one is operating, you have a sense of how you might deal with it, or what it's likely to evolve into if just left to its own demise. Okay. Well, thank you much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm going to do group model building part 2 on Thursday for those of you with the courage to attend, and we'll see if we can't work out some more discipline in the process. So, thank you much.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Bye-bye.